The History of North America podcast is a sweeping historical saga of the United States, Canada, and Mexico, from their deep origins to our present epoch. Join me, Mark Vinette, on this exciting, fascinating, epic journey through time, focusing on the compelling, wonderful, and tragic stories of North America's inhabitants, heroes, villains, leaders, environment, and geography. This incredible historical adventure follows a path of exciting events led by interesting people who reach beyond their grasp to touch key moments in time. The History of North America podcast series is an educational and entertaining look at the thrilling chronicle of North America, an action-packed tale of a continent that is still unfolding. I invite you to come along for the ride.
Thank you for listening to The History of the Papacy, and I'm your host, Steve. If you have any questions, comments, or feedback, you can always send me an email to my email address, steve@a2zhistorypage.com. What you just heard is a trailer for the History of North America podcast by Mark Vinette. I think the History of North America is a perfect topic for the podcast genre. There has been very little done on how the different pieces of North America all fit together. Canada has a lot in common with the U.S. The U.S. has a lot in common with Mexico, and Mexico and Canada seemingly don't have a lot in common, but in many ways they actually do. Now, those are just the bigger countries. There's just so much to get into with North America, and I'm definitely happy to hear that there is now a great podcast talking about this complicated story. Check out this podcast at markvinette.com or look in the show notes or search for in your favorite podcast or podcast app or whatever, too. That I'm sure it's in there as well. Now, you can follow the History of the Papacy on various social media networks by searching for A2Z History. Also, definitely check out the latest episodes of the History of the Papacy in 10 minutes on YouTube. I release those about once a week, or at least I try, and they are sort of like sidetrack episodes in visual form. So go to YouTube, search for the History of the Papacy, or follow the link in the show notes to watch these great episodes. And while you're there, make sure you hit the like button, subscribe, and ring the bell to get a notification when new episodes are uploaded and published. I also appreciate your Apple reviews on Apple Podcasts, so definitely send in those and rate and review the show on all the podcatchers. You also know what Patreon is, and if you sign up for Patreon, you will, of course, greatly help keep this whole operation going. You'll also get all new episodes completely advertisement free and early. You'll also get an audio feed of the YouTube exclusive, The History of the Papacy in 10 minutes. One of the best benefits is you will be admitted into a special club, the History of the Papacy Diptychs. By now, you know what this club is all about, and if you want to be commemorated, just sign up at patreon.com. Don't forget, those who enter the list first are remembered first, so don't wait. This time around, I want to thank AJ for his kind and generous donation on PayPal, and welcome our latest member of the History of the Papacy Diptychs, both at the Alexandria level, Brian and Jeffrey. Now, let us commemorate the Patreon patrons on the History of the Papacy Diptychs. We have Joran, William, Brian, and Jeffrey at the Alexandria level, and Paul the Magnificent at Constantinople. This is part 2 of a 2-part series of episodes I did with Joshua of the Our Foundations podcast. I tried to set up this series in the beginning of the last episode, but unfortunately that audio got corrupted and I couldn't use it. I didn't find this out until the last minute, as well as these things usually go. Thank you to YouTube commenter Plutonium Nico D for pointing this out to me. So instead, I'll set up the series a little bit here. Short story long, we recorded these episodes about a year ago, and I'm just getting around to publishing them. I think in a way it was a good thing, though, because it gave me a chance, and I hope it gives you a chance to reflect on how much the world has changed from November 2019, approximately when I recorded these episodes with Joshua, to November 2020. History stays the same, but the way we view it definitely changes. In part 2, which you'll hear today, we'll pick up right where we left off in part 1. In this series, I would suggest listening to the episodes in order, but as always, it's your call, and you can listen to them however you want to. This is an especially long setup, given that I didn't get to do any setup at all last time. I think it was necessary to contextualize this short series of episodes. These collaborative episodes with Joshua and others are definitely in the vein of what listener Jane from Facebook coined a mosaic of topics discussed in this podcast. I love that idea of the show being a mosaic. The little bits of tesserae may not look much individually, but when they all come together, they will hopefully help show a complete picture and tell a complete story. That is absolutely what I am going for here. I really appreciate Jane pointing this out to me, because I don't think I would have ever thought of something that deep and clever. So now, adding another piece of the mosaic of the history of the popes of Rome and Christian Church, our conversation, part 2, with Joshua of the Our Foundations podcast.
Yeah, definitely. I'm definitely reminded of many aspects. You talk about the major shifts in society when the Black Death came through and how it not only killed off a large portion of the population, but this had all kinds of effects on the local economies and on other aspects of society. This reminds me of, many of the different crises that have happened in more modern times. You could use maybe the Great Depression as an example, or maybe the rise of the internet, where so many people were losing their jobs to, well, maybe not only the internet, but technology, things like automation and the internet and brick and mortar places going out of business because online merchants are taking over. There's some major shifts economically, and a lot of these come through a crisis. I mentioned the Great Depression. You also have maybe the 2008 financial crisis that happens around the same time as this gigantic rise of technology comes to a head. And so we see some of those parallels. You mentioned the Avignon Papacy as well, and how this was a time when the church really was largely under the control of the nobility in France, and that there were a lot of ways that they were integrally tied together. And that really reminded me of maybe the 1900s, getting into the early and mid 1900s. In America, you had these foundations that really came into power. You had the Rockefeller Foundation, you had the Carnegie Endowment, you had JP Morgan, and they had so much influence to the point that they actually got together and created the Federal Reserve System. So they had large influence. You had Rockefellers that ran for president or that were involved in many other ways. I think one was the mayor of New York City. There are a lot of connections between these groups that were large power players, and I am comparing corporations to the historic nobility. So the parallel between the French nobility and these large corporate forces definitely makes a lot of sense here. And you talked about how really after this, you had the Crusades that had another very big impact on society, where you had these military endeavors that were going on all over the place, and they were really extending the resources of the people that were sending them. They couldn't really cope all by themselves. They needed some help. and they were spreading Christianity. They were expanding Christendom. This was a noble and worthy cause, we were all told. And this reminds me today of spreading democracy all around the world. And democracy is great. Everybody needs democracy. It is going to revitalize any country that doesn't have democracy. We'll go in, we'll take over the country, install democracy, and everything will be better. And we see the effect that has had in the Middle East, for example, but all over the world, Latin America, we have definitely made our rounds around the world as far as interventionism is concerned. And these are military conquests that are going on for a, quote, noble cause or a good cause, a just war. And so there are some parallels there. And with this, you said that there was a lack of resources, that oftentimes they didn't have the funds, they didn't have the logistics and the networks to get the supplies out to their armies, and they needed help. You mentioned that the merchants stepped in and provided some of this assistance with funds and with their large networks that they had built out for all of their endeavors to get rich and gain power, which they were very successful at. And so if I compare that to modern times, I am comparing specifically these merchant bakers that rose up, this merchant class, probably to big tech, I think is the best example here. And we see a very similar thing with big tech in relation to the government, for example, that the government really needs more technology. They need more data. They need these systems. They need these networks in order to carry out the things that they need to carry out or want to carry out. And so these technology companies really come into play and become very important as governments are trying to really learn how to analyze data and use data to their advantage, do things like missile guidance systems and lots of these technological aspects of any military engagement. We start to see that technology plays a very big role, and thus the technology companies are right there to step in and fill that role for them. And so then you mentioned how there was this upswing in the economy, and there were some changes where a lot of these merchants switched from being just merchants that were handling maybe physical goods, and they are stepping into this banker's role and really taking off and evolving into that role. And that reminds me of corporations that are largely changing today into this role of being more data collection services, where it's not just money, it's information. And I guess that's always been the case, that information is always the most valuable thing to anybody that wants power or control. And so that hasn't changed today,
absolutely.
But we see that in an kind of in-your-face kind of a way with corporations, that they're offering free services to all of society. And isn't this great? But it turns out that the reason why they're so free and they're so accessible is because they just need as much data as possible, because data is the currency of the modern age. That is what is the most valuable thing. And we see this shift that's going on there. You mentioned how we had gold rushing in from this age of exploration and the Spanish that were coming and bringing in these large shipments of gold, and all this influx of money was coming in. Well, we see a similar thing in our modern times, where we have now established a fiat monetary system basically all around the world. There's only a handful of countries that don't have a central bank that run a fiat currency system, whereas we used to be backed by gold largely, and there used to be kind of a value that money had behind it, whereas now we have this system that's been created, and the governments can just print money. And as long as the central banks all around the world print roughly the same amount of money at the same time, you don't have runaway inflation, because the inflation rates are the exact same. And so it works. And you have this large influx of money where governments are now carrying multiple trillions of dollars of debt per country. If you look at the overall debt for all the countries in the world, or at least the major countries in the world, the top few dozen, that adds up to a number that is very, very much in the negative realm. There's only a few major countries that are actually earning a profit and don't owe any debt. That's very rare. So how in the world could you have the balances of all these countries, if you add them all up, be in the negative of trillions of dollars? It's because they can basically print money out of nothing, but that the role that it plays on society, back to the parallel, is the same. We have this large influx of money, and governments are using these funds to do new building projects and to expand their role in society and give out more benefits. And we see a lot of prosperity that does come out of this. We see corporations expanding and a lot of government contracts that are going out to corporations. There was government money in the founding of Google, for example, and a lot of the biggest companies we have today, Tesla is another one taking off, and that was largely government funded to begin with. And so we see this government money that we have a large influx of. It's going into the society and into these businesses, and we see the economies all around the Western world have really been exploding into modern times. And so overall, I see that this whole timeline and these big aspects that you're talking about that really brought us to the Reformation, really set the stage. It puts us in this context of being ready for this big change. I see that we have a lot of similar aspects in today's world, which is really interesting. So we'll see how all this plays out if we are truly in a modern digital Reformation, but we don't know yet. We'll see how things go. But I do find that this is very interesting. And so if you have a little more to talk about related to coming into the Reformation and the Reformation movement, maybe, or if you want to go ahead and go into the role of the printing press, like I would say that the internet and technology has played today, the printing press played a big role in this technological advancement then. So take your pick if you want to carry on with the Reformation or go into the printing press and the role that that played.
I think we're in a very similar situation that they were in, for all the reasons that you laid out, that we're really on the precipice of something and we don't know what's next, because it really is, they always say that history repeats itself, but that's nothing that you can predict. You can predict that in the with 2020 hindsight, but when you're looking into the future with like you said, with the printing of money and where technology is going, we're in a very similar situation that those reformers and really everyone was at in the 1500s, and we're having the same people. There's people who want to go back to an old way. There's people who want to try and do different things, and, people splitting off, and, there's a lot of gloom and doom with a lot of people. And there's a lot of, what it really comes down to is that people aren't comfortable with where things are going in the future. And it's in a way that maybe our grandparents, great-grandparents a few generations ago, they had a pretty predictable path that they could follow and that they figured their children could follow. But I would argue that the people back in the 1500s, especially the people with a wider perspective of how things were going, but now more people, because of, the technology we have a larger perspective. And that was another thing too back then with, like we'll talk about in just a second, the printing press. It's widening people's perspective with the ability of information that they can take in. But there's only so much information that people can process and turn into usable, something that they can use. And I think that's what happened. And a lot of distortions can come through, and a lot of misunderstandings can come in. Misunderstandings of either not understanding information or misunderstanding of where somebody else is coming from that cause factions to split, and just cracks in the system. So that's where we can go back into the printing press. The printing press played an enormous role in Martin Luther being able to spread his message. Just really quickly, I don't know how much you've talked about this, but Martin Luther was a guy, he lived in the 1500s. He was an Augustinian monk, a particular kind of monk that had a particular theological stance, which really Augustinianism, which that's a whole nother ball of wax, but that really was a strong streak throughout his theology pre and post Reformation. He nailed, or he posted that, there's the famous nailing up the 99 theses, but that really wasn't a declaration of independence for him. Like, okay, now we're Lutherans and we're not with the Roman Church anymore. That was just a common thing that academics did back then. They would put up, the theses were 99 points that he said, well, I think this is wrong, and I think that this is not right because of X, Y, and Z. And scholars did that all the time back then, and it was really meant to just stimulate discussion. It just so happened that his was pretty radical and pretty controversial the way he laid them down, and that's kind of why they stuck. Luther was a great marketer himself, and he could really package a message that was really understandable. And that's where the printing press came along. Pamphleteering was pretty old by that point. People they would write up, like physically by hand, write up pamphlets and pass them out or stick them up. Undoubtedly, Luther had written out his 99 theses, but that printing press and that technology really made it so that pamphlets, like a broadsheet, one sheet of paper, could be made with a quick message on it and a picture, and they could just fire those out really quickly. Something like book technology actually wasn't quite the quantum leap over hand writing that it's oftentimes made it out to be. It's printing a book with the technology of that time, even with movable type, was a pretty laborious process. It cut down some of the costs, and it made some of the things better, like you could make much more accurate copies, but it was not like just, you weren't going to one day have one copy of the Bible at the cathedral church, and then, we've got movable type now, and now everybody can have their own Bible in their pocket. It took quite a while for that technology to catch up. But where the printing press and the technology that they had was in being able to make a lot of copies of these either really short books or one or two, one-page sheets that could send out a quick, effective message.
Yeah, that definitely makes a lot of sense, and I definitely see that today with the media and with the internet, and how we see a lot of these small one-page pamphlets that go around all over on Facebook and other platforms like this, and a lot of it is more clickbait articles that half the people don't even read all the way through, and hardly anybody actually checks the sources on. And I imagine it was probably similar back then, where if there was some scandalous information that someone wrote a little excerpt on, and it was probably to ruin the reputation of someone that they were against, but people would get that and probably be scandalized and gossip all about it all around town, and probably would not really research into it very much, even if they could. And so, yeah, definitely a lot of parallels there, both on the positive of all these new ways that you could educate yourself and expose yourself to new information and new perspectives, but also the negatives of all of this extra information that's there just to entertain you or distract you or manipulate you. Propaganda becomes much more effective if you can hand out maybe 10,000 pamphlets instead of handwriting out 1,000. You can get a lot more information, reach a lot more people, and it makes a big difference. Just like nowadays, now that we do have these social media platforms that virtually everybody is on at least 2 social media platforms on a daily basis. This is a very common thing in today's society. And so we have millions of people that are using these platforms and are exposed to all of these different types of pamphleteering, so to say, and it has a very large reach. It has a very large impact. So if we see an anti-establishment movement that really gains steam, a message that really latches on, we do have the technology for that to get out there, quickly and to spread to the masses, so to say. And we do see some hints of that, where I mentioned the Epstein story. Actually just saw today another news release on the Epstein case, where someone came out and talked about how he had been running this operation for longer than we thought, and the girls were younger than we thought, and all this other stuff. But we see things like that come out, where it's calling out corruption in the establishment institutions. And I know that did happen, for example, with Luther. He was calling out some issues that he had with the church. And like you said, this wasn't an outstanding thing. It wasn't that nobody had ever done this before. People did this fairly regularly as a part of discussion. But for whatever reason, I guess for all of these reasons that we've been talking about that really set the stage for this and really got it going, this actually did get going, and this time it really did take off, and he was someone that was very persuasive. And so I could see that coming today, where we do have corruption being called out. We do have anti-establishment movements both on the left and on the right, and from the libertarians. We have it from all over the place. And so we'll see if these gain steam. You mentioned how history doesn't necessarily repeat itself in a way that we can tell the future, and that is very true. But hopefully we can look at these trends and parallels and examples and at least see roughly where things are headed and what the potential is, so that we can maybe influence it if we so desire, or prepare ourselves for potential outcomes, or whatever the case may be. But there are some practical applications to better understanding our modern times in relation to very similar historical parallels. So hopefully this is something that we are getting out of this, that our listeners are getting out of this, but I know I have myself as I've been researching all this. It's very helpful. It really helps me to better understand things. I see things through a different lens, through a different perspective, and I hear stories that are coming out, and it's like, I've heard this before. I've seen this play out before. I know where this is going, and oftentimes they do play out in a very similar way. Not exactly, but in a very similar way. We see similar trends. What do you think about those things?
Yeah, I think that in our modern time, you can just see between when the major social media, when it really started, say in the, like 2008, the mid first decade of the 2000s, and you see the trends of how that changed. And so how the market of meaning how people used these tools to how the technology and how people used the technology, they kind of evolved together, where Facebook originally was really just a way to catch up with friends and make new friends. Now it's a completely marketing and data and sales tool, a lot of these things, and it's almost hidden even with influencers and things that, if you had gone to your somebody you knew in 1998, they'd think you were a lunatic if you were saying that on this little thing I hold in my hand, I can have access to the whole world, and people, from the middle of nowhere have 100,000 people all around the world who are following every single thing that they type into this little rectangle on their hand. And that you're gonna, we call it your phone, but you almost never make phone calls on it. I think that is literally as early back as probably, I would even say like the year 2000, somebody would have said you were nuts and would have called that complete science fiction. Yeah,
it was on Star Trek, I believe. They had devices like that.
I mean, it's even more high tech than what they had.
That is true. Yeah, so getting
than what they had envisioned.
Yeah. So I've actually read a quote from the author of A Brave New World, and he had mentioned that there are many technologies that he imagined, and he placed those into this fantastical book. But as of, I think the speech that I was looking at that the quote came from was from the 60s. And as of that time period, he said that he's already seeing these things come to light and the impact that they're having on society, and that the things that he thought were fantastical are turning into reality. And so we see that playing out, again, like you just mentioned, in our modern times with social media and smartphones and all of this, just like he saw even way back in the 60s. So it's really interesting.
And it's just happened so quickly. And that, the pace of life was obviously a lot slower back then, but the changes that happened then, with all those changes that we listed out earlier, they happened at lightning speed by that point. And it's really a big part of it is how much time do people need to be able to absorb that change and to really incorporate it into their lives and make it where it's natural to them. And we're in a big flux right now where you have kids who understand this technology intimately, and their parents don't understand it at all. That's obviously going to cause some sort of disruption, and from the micro scale to the family to society.
Yeah, definitely. And I will probably bring that up near the end, because that does play into what I believe might be coming for us in the future. But you mentioned the rate of change, and that's something that I have kind of struggled with as I've been doing these different parallels and playing them out and comparing them to modern times, because like you said, things were much more slow in their pace than they are today. And we see, like, for example, I had just mentioned everything from the Great Depression to modern times with fiat money, setting the stage for where we are today and comparing to you setting the stage for the Reformation. And if you look at, for example, the 1900s, that would take you just prior to the Federal Reserve, prior to the Great Depression, prior to World War I, and all of these big changes, up to even all the way to the present. That's roughly a little over 100 years, whereas this time period we are looking at that have very similar parallels take place over a much larger time period. And so it's really interesting that as I look forward to what's possibly coming and how things are changing and how they might evolve, it's really interesting because as we look at the historical examples, it might have taken 200 or 300 years for a change to happen, whereas today we might see that change in a matter of 2 or 3 decades. And so there's definitely a huge difference here.
Yeah, I remember seeing back when I was a kid, I think it was my grandfather had this old magazine, and I looked at it, and they had how the perspective of a person's changed, like, and how they relate to the world. And it was, the first picture was like this massive globe with a person like a speck, and you couldn't even see it. And as the time went by up to like the 60s, the world got smaller and the person got bigger. I mean, now you have the world at your hands, at your complete fingertips, so how much has our perspective on world events changed? But have we changed that much to be able to absorb all of that information and all of that perspective?
Yeah, definitely. You mentioned that example, that analogy. You could take that a step further and take it into like a philosophical perspective where modern day people view themselves as more of the center of the world than probably prior generations did. And we see that playing out, and it's very similar to this question that you're asking about what will the impact of all of these technological changes be if we can't even catch up to them and we're not at that point, we can't digest them at this rate. And it's the same thing when you talk about philosophy and ideology. We have so many changes coming with postmodernism and existentialism and this view today that there is no such thing as truth. What's true to you is different than what's true to me me, which is different than what's true to somebody else, which actually is different than the actual definition of truth. But we see that there is no such thing as truth. There is no such thing as morality. These things, we can't have a concrete idea of these things, and therefore we have a society today that is not very grounded. They don't really know what to think. They don't really have a system to follow and to fit into. And so we see things like people being very depressed. They feel like they don't fit into the world. They're not serving a higher purpose of any kind. We see people getting radicalized over the internet by watching some YouTube videos. It sounds crazy, but they are seeing that there are these other people, generally on the other side of the world, that have these radical views, but they mean it. They are following it because they truly believe it, and they are living it out. They are doing it. This is real. This is genuine. They have a structure that tells them what's right and what's wrong, and they live by that. They actually do this, and that's a stark contrast to people in, let's say, Western society today, where it's kind of just anything goes. We don't really know what's right, what's wrong. And if you actually say that your opinion is that something is right or wrong, then you're probably going to get canceled on Twitter because that was not politically correct. And so, a lot of these issues with digesting these changes that are occurring so fast in modern times, that they're definitely going to have an impact on our future, and things are going to, I would guess, possibly explode. We might have some big issues that, looking back maybe 100 years from now, looking back to our modern times that we're living in today, we might see that this was a huge turning point because of all these different factors we're talking about. And it's not just technology, it's not just philosophy, it's not just any one of these things, it's how they all come together to this confluence of events and this milieu that we're living in. It all comes together. It all interacts together. It's all intertwined. It's a web. And it really feels like it's coming to a head. And if we look at the historical parallel, it was coming to a head when all these factors were at play. And it wasn't just affecting one aspect. It was affecting many aspects of society. So getting back into that, what about the aspects related to finance and economics that were occurring with all of these changes in this time period? We have these huge societal changes that are going on, and you have already mentioned a few times there were some economic impacts to this, and we see this in the institutional church as well as society as a whole. And you've mentioned the merchant bankers. We've mentioned the name Medici before. How are all of these things impacted with all these changes that are occurring?
The Medici and the bankers, their function was really to move the money around that the church accumulated from various sources and either use it for purposes that the church wanted it for. Maybe it was building new church buildings, alms to the poor, the various functions to the church, or to get it to certain kings for certain purposes, or even lend the money out. A big way that the church got money, and really its main way, and historically the main way that it got money, was that the money, a lot of the wealth that the church got started from basic contributions that a person in their local parish put a couple of coins into gave a couple of coins to the church. They were technically supposed to give a tithe, a tenth of their income to the church, or sometimes called their first fruits, like the first percentage of the money or the goods that they earned in a year, they would give it to the church. Now, that local parish, they passed up some of that money and those resources to the level of the hierarchy above them. So then that next level of hierarchy, they accumulated some money. Obviously, each step has to keep some for their own operations, but they moved some up to the next level, to the next level, to the next level. And you needed people to be able to do that, the transactions, and move that money. I mean, it starts, a little bit down at the bottom, really starts to turn into a serious flow of money when you start, when it's all of Europe doing it. There was also special donation times where sometimes they would collect money from people, from parishioners, and that would go straight to a certain thing. Maybe it would go to Rome. There was also, they could raise money through things called indulgences, which that was one of the things that really tweaked Martin Luther for a variety of reasons, both because of the corruption angle and theological angles, which we don't really need to get into at this point. But those indulgences, they were a kind of a pass for a penance. When you do a sin in Catholicism, then you have to do something to make up for that sin. Now, you can't just pay it off. You can't say, okay, here's $50, get me out of this one. You have to do something for it to get out of that penance. It might be saying prayers. If it's a pretty bad thing, it might be doing a pilgrimage. So you go to one of the major pilgrimage sites. If it was, if your sin was pretty low grade, you could go to the local shrine of a saint that was important. If it was something a little bit bigger, maybe you have to do a pilgrimage to Rome or Santiago de Compostela or something like that. And the indulgence was another way to do that. You could get one of these indulgences for somebody who had died and take some years off of their time in purgatory, or you could get one of these indulgences to you could get that to take some time off of your own time in purgatory. And people really, this was super hyper important to them. You could also, there was a roundabout way that you could make a donation to the church. So you're not exactly buying the indulgence, you're donating to the church, which earns you an indulgence, which that indulgence means that you're getting some time off of purgatory, or you're getting a dispensation from doing a certain type of penance. So, I mean, you could see pretty clearly how somebody could say, you're not donating it to the church. You're giving them a coin to get this piece of paper that says you're getting so much time off of your time in purgatory. It's a one-to-one transaction if you're looking at it that way, not in the roundabout way, in the way that it probably really did work, that you would, you were making a sacrifice to the church, and the church was giving back to you from their powers of giving you penance. Now, there was some actual, corruption or some unethical behavior with the indulgences in a neighboring county and an area where Martin Luther lived, by a monk called Johann Tetzel, who pretty much was just directly selling these indulgences for, as a one-to-one transaction. And he was, he made up songs to sell the indulgences. It was pretty cheesy. And he was trying to make a name for himself, to basically raise as much money as he could to send that money to Rome, because they were trying to rebuild a major cathedral in Rome, St. Peter's Basilica. It's not technically a cathedral, but we won't split hairs here. But they were trying to raise money to fix up that basilica. So Johann Tetzel was trying to raise a lot of money, and he did do some things that were unethical. And Martin Luther definitely saw that, and he called him out on it.
Okay, yeah, there's one thing that really stood out to me when you were mentioning how indulgences work. It definitely reminded me of campaign contributions, where a corporation might donate money to a political campaign. They're not necessarily buying anything with it, just a donation. And if they just so happen to get a government contract or get to write the regulation that regulates their industry in the following years, then, it just happened. It's a coincidence. And yeah, we definitely see that going on in every political campaign that comes through. So yeah, definitely some parallels there. What about the way that the church would choose who would be a member of their hierarchy? How would they choose their employees, so to say, and how would they pick who is going to be a bishop, who's going to be a pope, who's going to be a priest? How would people get those positions?
The church really, they had access to probably, really the most intelligent and talented people in the entire, and really, and for the most part, in what you could call Christendom, anyway, where they were particularly in Western Europe. If there was somebody who was showing an intellectual aptitude or had talent in administration, the church took them in because there wasn't any really other option for most people to exercise those skills. There were only so many places. If you weren't going to really work your way into the aristocracy through any sort of merit-based activities. But the church was a place where you could go in and become a clerk. And if you were, showed some aptitude, they could teach you to read, teach you numeracy, teach you all of those skills that you could use. So they snatched up a huge talent pool from all over every country and every municipality and duchy. They could get the people, and those were the church was the one who had the educational facilities and the ability to teach people. And really, even after the Reformation, universities were still religiously minded places for a long, long time. I mean, you look even at the earliest colleges founded in the U.S., places like Harvard, Yale, Princeton, they were set up by particular religious denominations. Theology was really the main department, and reverends and pastors, they were the early presidents and leaders of those places. Religious education was really, that was the place where people went if they had the aptitude for learning. It was really one of your very few options.
Yeah, so it sounds like the church was the place that you wanted to gain a position in. It had a lot of perks. It was kind of the cream of the crop, the people that were at the top of the chain, and that's where people would love to get a job landed. And we see that oftentimes with state jobs today. They are thought of as being these gravy jobs where you don't really have to work really hard, but generally you have to at least either know somebody, if you want to go that angle, just like there were things like simony and other aspects of getting into church positions. But the other way is to be good in a specific field. You get brought on under a government contract or into a government job, and then you can kind of just ride it out and do whatever you like. And that's kind of the ultimate position that someone would want to be in, because it is the ultimate establishment that's above all the other institutions. And that is a very good place to be. That's considered a very stable job, a steady job, a good job, a respectable job. And I see that sounds very similar to working for the church and being a part of their bureaucracy or their hierarchy. It sounds fairly similar here. And with that, we had the church that I'm referencing as being the top dog, the top institution. Well, with that, as we've been talking about economic factors and finance and stuff, what were some of the aspects of economic leverage that the church had over the nobility or over the merchant class, over these other institutional players that were in the society at that time?
One of the main leverages that the church had over nobles and even the merchants and the banking dynasties is, in short, they had the leverage, they had spiritual leverage that they could excommunicate or essentially kick out someone from the religion. So that's cutting them, that's cutting them out of this entire central part of their lifestyle. I mean, almost if you're going to put it in a modern parallel, like getting permanently banned from Twitter, it's cutting you out of the social function of every aspect of your life. Now, they also, beyond that religious power, they had this access, this ready access to tons and tons of resources. So they could change the flow of, I'm not going to use this banker anymore. I'm going to use a different banking house, and that's almost instant death sentence to the banking house that they switched from. So that's a huge amount of leverage that they have. They can also, because they're not a state, the Pope can talk to the leadership of Spain. Oh, maybe you shouldn't help France in that war against the Holy Roman Empire. So now France is at a disadvantage. Or maybe they talk to France and say, hey, I know you've been thinking about attacking Spain. Maybe we'll throw some money your way to make that happen more. Or maybe in a next conflict, you'll have access to our army of mercenaries, or maybe we'll talk to another, principality, and they'll be able to help you in something. So they had a lot of the soft power that they could really nudge things in different directions, and sometimes it worked really well, and obviously in other times the popes did fall on their face, but that's a huge amount of power that they had at their hands, at their fingertips.